The sun beat down on the cobblestone streets of Oakhaven. It was a warm, heavy gold, the kind of light that melted the frost from deep within the bones. For 4 long years, Eleanor had chased the sun. She needed it. She needed the heat to wash away the memory of the cold, the memory of the rain. The bakery smelled of yeast, melted butter, and cinnamon. It was a safe smell, a grounding smell. Eleanor buried her hands in the soft dough on the wooden counter. She pushed. She folded. She kneaded. The rhythm was hypnotic. It was the steady heartbeat of her new life. She wore a simple linen dress. The fabric was rough, practical, and stained with flour. Her hands were no longer soft. They were not the hands of a duchess. They were calloused. They were scarred by the oven's heat. They were strong. She preferred these hands. They had built this life. They had built this sanctuary. Outside the open window, the seagulls cried. The salty breeze of the ocean swept through the small shop. It ruffled the stray strands of chestnut hair that had escaped her messy braid. She closed her eyes. She breathed in the salt. She breathed in the peace. But peace was a fragile thing. Sometimes, when the wind howled at night, she was pulled back to the marble floors of the Blackwood estate, back to the towering, unforgiving walls of a home that was never truly hers, back to the night the sky broke open. She could still hear the thunder. It echoed in the dark corners of her mind. She could still feel the freezing rain slicing into her skin like 1,000 tiny blades. She remembered his eyes. Alexander, the Duke of Blackwood, the man who had vowed to protect her, the man who looked at her that night with a disgust so pure it stopped her heart. He had believed the lies. He had listened to the poisoned whispers of his court. He believed she was a traitor, a thief, a woman without honor. He did not give her a chance to speak. He did not see the terror in her eyes. He only pointed to the door. He commanded his guards to throw her out into the merciless storm. He told her she was dead to him. The heavy oak doors had slammed shut. The sound was a final deafening crack. It severed her from her past. It threw her into an abyss. He did not know. He did not know about the secret she carried beneath her rain-soaked cloak. He did not know he was throwing away his own flesh and blood. A sudden clatter broke her reverie. Eleanor's eyes that snapped open. The memory of the cold vanished. The warmth of the bakery rushed back in. Mama, look. A small boy burst through the back door. He was a hurricane of energy and laughter. He held up a wooden toy boat, his face smeared with dirt and berry jam. This was Leo. He was 4 years old. He was the center of her universe. He was the reason she survived the freezing nights. He was the fire that kept her walking when she wanted to lay down and die in the mud. Eleanor wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron. A smile broke across her face. It was a real smile. It reached her eyes and erased the shadows of the past. "Is that a new ship for the Royal Navy, my little lion?" she asked. Her voice was soft melodic and full of absolute adoration. Leo ran to her and wrapped his small arms around her legs. "Mr. Higgins made it for me. It sails in the puddles." Eleanor knelt down. She brushed the dark, unruly curls from his forehead. She wiped a smudge of dirt from his cheek. Her breath hitched. Just for a second. It always did when she looked at him too closely. Leo had her smile. He had her gentle nature, but his face belonged to the man who broke her. He had Alexander's aristocratic jawline. He had the same proud tilt of the chin. And his eyes. The eyes were a mirror she could not escape. They were a piercing, stormy grey. They held the weight of centuries of Blackwood nobility. She loved those eyes, because they were Leo's. She refused to let the ghost of the Duke taint the love she had for her son. "It is a beautiful ship," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Now go wash those hands. The sweet rolls are almost ready." Leo cheered and sprinted towards the wash basin. Eleanor stood up. She took a deep breath. She looked around her bakery. The sun was still shining. The ovens were warm. She was safe. Leo was safe. The Duke of Blackwood was a lifetime away. He was a ghost. And ghosts could not cross the sea. She turned back to the dough. Suddenly the wind shifted. The bell above the bakery door did not ring. The air in the room simply grew heavy. The salty breeze died away, replaced by a sudden suffocating stillness. Eleanor paused. Her hands hovered over the wooden counter. A strange chill crept up the back of her neck. Outside, the rhythmic crunch of carriage wheels rolled onto the cobblestones of Oakhaven. It was a heavy sound. Deliberate. Powerful. It was a sound that did not belong in a quiet coastal town. Eleanor looked out the window. The golden sunlight seemed to dim. A massive unmarked black carriage had stopped in the town square. 4 coal-black horses stamped their hooves impatiently. The temperature in the bakery seemed to drop. The smell of cinnamon faded. Eleanor's heart began to hammer against her ribs. The rhythm of her peaceful life shattered. She did not know who was in that carriage, but her body remembered the trauma before her mind could process it. She heard the echo of the thunder. She heard the slamming of a heavy oak door. The storm had found her. The carriage swayed. The velvet curtains were drawn tight. Alexander preferred the dark. It matched the inside of his mind. He sat in the corner of the opulent cabin. He was a creature of shadows. He was the Duke of Blackwood. Men feared his name. Kings sought his counsel. But in the silence of this carriage he was nothing but a hollow shell. He poured a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. His hand trembled. Just a fraction. But it was there. He downed the whiskey. It burned his throat. It did nothing to numb the ache in his chest. 4 years. It had been 4 years since that night. 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. He counted every single one. He closed his eyes. He leaned his head back against the leather seat. He did not want to remember. But the memory was a predator. It always hunted him down. The crashing thunder. The blinding flash of lightning. The heavy oak doors of Blackwood Manor. He remembered her standing there. Eleanor. Her clothes were soaked. Her dark hair clung to her pale face. She looked so small. She looked so fragile. He had towered over her. He had been a god of wrath. He had listened to the venomous whispers of his advisors. They showed him forged letters. They showed him stolen jewels. They spun a web of lies so tight it suffocated his reason. He believed them. He believed she had betrayed his family. He believed she had sold his secrets. He remembered the words he spoke. They were carved into his soul. You are poison. You are nothing. Get out. He threw her into the freezing storm. He watched the heavy doors slam shut. He sealed her fate. He thought he was cutting out a rot. He thought he would feel righteous. He thought he would feel clean. Instead, the moment the latch clicked into place, a profound, terrifying silence fell over the manor. It was the silence of a tomb. And the tomb was of his own making. The days that followed were a blur of ash and ice. He purged his court. He banished the sycophants who had brought the accusations. He didn't care if they were right. He hated them for making him a monster. But the monster was already awake. He stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the rain. He felt the phantom chill of the storm. He saw her wide, shattered eyes. She had not begged. She had not screamed. She had simply looked at him as if he had plunged a dagger into her heart. Now he was a ghost haunting his own vast estates. He pushed his body to the breaking point. He worked until he collapsed. He rode his horses until they lathered. He traveled relentlessly. If he stopped moving, the ghosts caught up. That was why he was here. The carriage jolted over rough cobblestones. The iron wheels ground against the stone. He was in Oakhaven, a miserable, insignificant speck on the coast. He had come to finalize the purchase of a new shipping fleet. His managers had begged to handle it. They told him it was beneath the Duke. They didn't understand. He needed the distraction. He needed the punishing, bumpy roads. The carriage finally lurched to a halt. Alexander opened his eyes. They were bleak, storm cloud grey. They were hard. They were merciless. The carriage door swung open. His footman bowed low. Golden, blinding sunlight flooded the dark cabin. It was offensive. It was entirely too cheerful. Alexander stepped out. The sea breeze hit him instantly. It was warm. It smelled of salt tar and drying nets. He hated it. He adjusted his tailored black coat. He gripped the silver head of his cane. He stood at his full, intimidating height. He cast a long, dark shadow over the sunlit town square. The chatter around him died. The townspeople froze. They stared at the black carriage. They stared at the imposing man in black velvet and midnight silk. They recognized power. They recognized danger. Alexander ignored them. They were irrelevant. He began to walk. The rhythmic tap of his cane struck the cobblestones. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like a ticking clock. He headed toward the Merchant Guild at the end of the street. He wanted to sign the contracts. He wanted to leave before the sun set. He walked past a row of small, quaint shops, a blacksmith, a tailor, a bakery. As he passed the open window of the bakery, he stopped. His boots ground to a halt. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't know why, but a sudden, violent twist seized his gut. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was a panicked, frantic rhythm. The warm breeze carried a scent. Cinnamon. Melted butter. It was a common smell, but beneath it there was something else. A subtle phantom fragrance. Lavender and rain. It was her scent. Alexander stood perfectly still in the middle of the street. The bustling town of Oakhaven faded into a blur. The bright sun seemed to dim. He stared at the wooden door of the small bakery. His chest heaved. It was impossible. She was gone. She had disappeared into the night 4 years ago. His investigators had found nothing. Not a trace. Yet standing in the heat of the afternoon sun, the Duke of Blackwood shivered. He felt a single icy drop of rain hit his skin. Alexander stood frozen. The sun was hot on his back. The air was thick with the smell of the sea, but he felt only ice. He told himself it was madness, a trick of the wind. Lavender and rain did not belong in a coastal fishing town. She did not belong here. She was a phantom born of his own relentless guilt. He tightened his leather-gloved grip on his silver-headed cane. His knuckles turned white. He forced himself to breathe in, breathe out. He was Alexander. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He did not chase ghosts in common streets. He turned his shoulder. He took one step away from the bakery, then another. He needed to find his shipping managers. He needed to sign the papers and leave this wretched place. Then the wooden door flew open. It banged violently against the stone wall. The sound was sharp. It cut straight through the low hum of the market square. A small figure tumbled out onto the cobblestones. It was a boy. He was moving far too fast. His little legs pumped with wild abandon. He tripped over an uneven stone. He went skidding across the rough ground. He crashed directly into Alexander's immaculate black boots. A wooden toy boat flew from his hands. It clattered against the stone, stopping against Alexander's cane. Alexander scowled. A flash of dark annoyance crossed his features. He looked down. He expected a crying urchin. He expected a frantic apologizing mother running out to beg for his pardon. He did not expect the breath to be completely punched from his lungs. The boy did not cry. He sat up. He dusted off his small, rough-spun trousers. He rubbed his scraped knee. He merely frowned. It was a deep, serious, calculating frown. Then he tilted his head back. He looked up at the towering man in black. Alexander stared. The world tilted violently on its axis. The noise of the fishmongers, the crying seagulls, the crashing waves, it all faded into a dull, rushing hum. The only sound left in the universe was the frantic, deafening hammering of his own heart. The boy had messy, dark, chestnut curls. They were wild. They were untamed in the sea breeze. He had a smudge of white flour on his nose, but it was not the flour or the rough clothes Alexander saw. It was the face. It was the jawline. Proud. Stubborn. Unyielding. It was the exact arrogant tilt of the chin. It was a face he saw every single time he looked into the gilded mirrors of Blackwood Manor. But it was the eyes that stopped his heart from beating. The boy blinked. At the bright coastal sunlight caught his irises. They were not a common brown. They were not a pale blue. They were grey. Not just any grey. They were the colour of a churning, violent storm. They were the colour of the thunderclouds that rolled over his estates. They were the undeniable ancient mark of his bloodline. Alexander could not breathe. His chest tightened until a physical pain ripped through his sternum. He looked at the boy. The boy looked back. There was absolutely no fear in the child's face. Only a calm, steady assessing curiosity. It was a Blackwood trait. To be fearless in the face of giants. "My boat," the boy said. His voice was small but shockingly clear. He pointed a chubby dirt-stained finger at the wooden toy resting near Alexander's boot. Alexander's hand trembled violently. His iron control shattered. His heavy silver cane slipped from his grasp. It hit the cobblestones with a sharp, echoing clack. He did not even blink at the sound. He slowly, agonizingly sank to one knee. The fine, priceless velvet of his trousers soaked up the dust and grime of the street. He didn't care. He couldn't feel his legs. He reached out a shaking, gloved hand. He wanted to touch the boy's cheek. He needed to know if he was real. He needed to know if this was just another cruel, alcohol-fueled hallucination. "Who?" Alexander choked out. His voice was a raspy, broken whisper. It was stripped of all its commanding power. "Who are you?" The boy tilted his head further. "I'm Leo." Leo. The name echoed in Alexander's hollow mind. A strong name. A lion. Then the math hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. 4 years. She had been gone for 4 years. The boy standing in front of him was 3. Maybe 4. The night of the storm. The night he threw her into the freezing, merciless rain. The night he locked the gates. Oh God. The realization crashed over him. It was a tidal wave of absolute horror and shattering awe. She was pregnant. When he banished her into the dark, she was carrying his child. His heir. His own flesh and blood. And he had thrown them out to die in the mud. Bile rose bitter in his throat. The edges of his vision darkened with sudden dizziness. He stared into those storm-grey eyes, seeing the full, staggering magnitude of his sin reflected back at him. "Leo," Alexander whispered. A single hot tear broke free from his hardened eyes. It slid down his rigid cheek. The Duke of Blackwood, the man made of iron and ice, wept openly in the dust of a common street. He moved his trembling hand an inch closer. His fingers brushed a dark curl from the boy's warm forehead. "Leo, you forgot your sails." The voice drifted from the open door of the bakery. It was soft. It was melodic. It was a voice that had haunted his darkest nightmares and his most desperate waking dreams for over 1,000 agonizing days. Alexander froze entirely. The blood in his veins turned to liquid nitrogen. His hand dropped back to his side. He slowly, mechanically lifted his head. He looked past the small boy. He looked toward the deep shadow of the doorway. A woman stepped out into the golden, blinding sunlight. She wore a faded linen dress. A simple apron was tied tightly around her waist. Her hands were heavily dusted with white flour. She looked down at the street. She looked at her son. Then her gaze shifted. She looked at the giant man kneeling in the dirt. The flour-covered wooden spoon slipped from her numb fingers. It hit the ground. Her face drained of all color, turning ashen pale. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. The fragile piece she had so carefully built shattered into a million jagged pieces. Eleanor. She was here. She was alive. And she was looking right into the eyes of the monster who had broken her. Neither of them breathed. The wind completely stopped. The sun seemed to hold its place in the sky. The storm had finally caught up. The wooden spoon rolled across the cobblestones. It was a dull, hollow sound. It was the only sound in the world. Eleanor could not breathe. The air was entirely gone. It had been sucked out of the street by the sheer crushing mass of his presence. Alexander. He was here, kneeling in the dirt of Oak Haven, staring at her son. A primal violent instinct snapped her paralysis. It was the instinct of a mother wolf protecting her pup. It bypassed logic. It bypassed fear. It was pure adrenaline-fueled survival. She moved. She moved faster than she ever had in her life. She lunged forward into the blinding sunlight. She grabbed Leo by his small, rough-spun shirt. She yanked him back with a fierce, desperate strength. She pulled him behind her thick linen skirts. She shielded him from the storm. She shielded him from the Duke. "Mama?" Leo asked. His voice was small. It was confused. It was entirely innocent. It was a terrible, jarring contrast to the silent war suddenly raging above his head. "Hush, Leo," Eleanor said. Her voice was not soft. It was iron. It was forged in the freezing rain and the fires of her own resilience. Alexander slowly rose. He looked like a fallen titan, waking from a nightmare. The grey dust clung to his immaculate black velvet trousers. He did not brush it off. He did not seem to notice. He stood at his full, intimidating height. He cast a long, cold shadow over her. But Eleanor did not shrink. 4 years ago, she would have trembled. 4 years ago, she would have fallen to her knees and wept at his feet, begging for him to listen. Not today. Today she was a wall of solid ice. Eleanor," Alexander breathed. His voice was a ragged, broken sound. It sounded like tearing silk. It carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. He took a hesitant step forward. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand toward her face. "Do not say my name!" Her words sliced through the warm coastal air. They were sharper than any executioner's blade. Alexander flinched. The great and terrible Duke of Blackwood physically recoiled. His trembling hand dropped to his side. He looked at her. He really looked at her for the first time in 4 years. He saw the white flour dusting her apron. He saw the heavy calluses on her once soft hands. He saw the fierce, unyielding light burning in her eyes. She was no longer the fragile girl he had broken. She was a queen of her own making. She was magnificent. And she hated him. Then his gaze drifted downward. It locked onto the small boy, peering curiously out from behind her skirt. "The boy," Alexander whispered. His massive chest heaved. Every single breath seemed to cause him physical agony. "Eleanor," his eyes. He is mine." Eleanor cut him off instantly. Her tone was absolute. It left no room for debate. "He is mine," Alexander insisted. The desperation in his voice was raw. It was bleeding. "Eleanor, I can see it. He has my face. He has the Blackwood eyes. You were with child. When I... He could not finish the sentence. The memory of the heavy oak doors slamming shut choked him. Eleanor's face remained a mask of flawless, unreadable marble. Inside her heart was a trapped bird battering violently against her ribs. She was terrified. She was cornered. But she would die before she let him see her bleed. You see what you want to see, Your Grace. She spat his title like a vile curse. You see ghosts because your conscience is rotting from the inside out. Alexander stared at her. His stormy grey eyes were wide. They were pleading. He is 3 years old. Alexander said, his voice shaking uncontrollably. The timeline. The eyes. Do not lie to me, Eleanor. I beg of you. I'm on my knees in my mind. Do not lie to me now. I do not owe you the truth. She snapped, her eyes narrowing. But I will give it to you, so you will turn your carriage around and never come back. She lifted her chin. She looked straight into his hollow, haunted soul. I nearly died in that rain, Alexander. I bled in the mud. It was a partial truth. The most convincing lies always were. Whatever tied us together died that night. You killed it. You made sure of it. Alexander let out a choked, devastated gasp. He took a staggering step back. It was as if she had driven a physical wooden stake directly into his chest. I crawled to the coast. Elena continued. Her rhythm was hypnotic in its cold, steady cruelty. I met a man, a sailor. A good, kind man who did not throw women into freezing storms based on the whispers of snakes. He gave me a home. He gave me a son. She reached down and pulled Leo closer to her leg, resting a protective hand on his dark curls. Leo is his son, not yours. Alexander shook his head violently. No, I don't believe you. I can see myself in him. His eyes. Many men have grey eyes, Your Grace. Elena said coldly, not blinking once. The world does not revolve around the sacred Blackwood bloodline. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the cobblestone street. The smell of burning sugar began to drift from the open bakery door. Her sweet rolls were burning in the oven. She didn't care. Let them burn. Let it all burn. Alexander looked utterly shattered. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death sentence and told to read it aloud. He stared at the boy. Then he stared back at Eleanor. He searched her face for a single crack, for a tiny flicker of deceit. But Eleanor was a fortress. She had built these defensive walls stone by agonizing stone over 4 long years. He could not break them down with a single tearful look in the middle of the street. Your husband! Alexander forced the words out. They tasted like bitter ash on his tongue. Where is he? The sea took him last winter. Eleanor lied, smoothly. Her face remained a perfect blank canvas of mild grief. Now it is just Leo and me, and we do not need the charity, the money, or the pathetic pity of a monster. Alexander flinched again. The word, a monster, hit him perfectly. It was a flawless strike. It was precisely what he called himself in the endless dark. Eleanor, please, if there is even a fraction of a chance. There is no chance, she cut him off entirely. You made your choice 4 years ago. You chose your advisors. You chose your immense pride. You chose the door. She bent down with sharp, deliberate movements and picked up her flour-covered wooden spoon. She stood tall, her posture regal, despite her common clothes. Go back to your manor, Your Grace. Go back to your empty wealth. Leave us in peace, because if you ever come near my son again, I swear to God I will kill you myself. She did not wait for his answer. She turned her back on him completely. She ushered Leo inside the warm, smoke-filled bakery. She stepped over the threshold. She grabbed the heavy wooden door with both hands. She looked back one last time. Alexander was still standing frozen in the dirt. The bright sun beat down on his bowed head. He looked utterly, hopelessly broken. A king without a kingdom. Eleanor felt a tiny, treacherous pang in her chest. A ghost of the girl who used to love him. She ruthlessly crushed it. She slammed the door shut. She slid the heavy iron bolt into place. The carriage was a tomb. It swallowed Alexander whole. He sat in the pitch-black cabin. The velvet curtains were drawn tight against the setting sun. He did not move. He did not blink. He barely breathed. Her words echoed in the dark. He is mine. The sea took him. You are a monster. She was a magnificent liar. She was a queen wrapped in a baker's apron. But he knew. The blood in his veins knew. The storm-grey eyes of that child were a mirror. They were the undeniable Blackwood legacy. They could not be faked. They could not be born of a common sailor. Leo was his son. Eleanor had stood in the rain. She had stood at his door carrying his heir, and he had locked her out. The thought was a physical blade turning slowly in his gut. The carriage arrived at the coastal inn. Alexander stepped out into the twilight. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying stone. His men stepped back. They recognized the look. It was the look of a duke going to war. Silas, Alexander barked. A shadow detached itself from the wall. It was his spy master. A man of quiet footsteps and deadly secrets. Your Grace, Silas murmured, bowing low. The files from 4 years ago, Alexander commanded. His voice was a low, dangerous growl. The night of the banishment, the letters, the testimonies, the jeweled necklace. I want everything. Silas blinked, just once. They are in the vault at the manor, Your Grace, a 3-day ride. Then ride, Alexander snarled. Kill the horses if you must. Buy new ones. If you are not back with those papers in 4 days, I will take your head. Silas vanished into the night. For 4 agonizing days, Alexander did not sleep. He did not eat. He paced the floorboards of his rented room. The wood groaned under his heavy boots. He was a caged beast. He stared out the window at the distant flickering lights of the town. He looked toward the bakery. It was a small warm glow in the dark. It was a universe away. He replayed that terrible night in his mind 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. He remembered Lord Sterling, his trusted advisor. Sterling had brought the letters. Sterling had found the jewels in Eleanor's chambers. Sterling had whispered the poison into his ear. She is a spy, Your Grace. She's selling our secrets to the crown. Why had he believed it so easily? Because he was terrified. He was terrified of how much he loved her. He was terrified that a common-born girl had brought the great Duke of Blackwood to his knees. He had used the lies as a shield. He had used his anger to protect his fragile, arrogant heart. On the 4th night, the heavy door crashed open. Silas stood there. He was covered in mud. He was gasping for air. He held a heavy iron lockbox in his bruised hands. Alexander snatched it. He tore the lid open. The iron hinges screamed. He dumped the contents onto the heavy oak desk. Dust and old wax spilled across the wood. He lit a dozen candles. The room blazed with a frantic, flickering light. He grabbed the first letter. The letter that had condemned her. He stared at the looping handwriting. He stared at the wax seal. 4 years ago he had read it with eyes blinded by fury. Tonight, he read it with eyes sharpened by a desperate, agonizing clarity. He traced the ink with his finger. He pulled a magnifying glass from his coat pocket. He held it over the parchment. His breath stopped. The ink was wrong. It was a slight variation of the royal blue used by the court. It was a cheaper dye. It pulled differently at the edges of the letters. He grabbed another parchment. A ledger of her supposed treasonous meetings. He checked the dates. November the 4th. Eleanor could not have been at the docks on November the 4th. She had been bedridden with a severe fever. He remembered. He had sat by her side. He had held a cool cloth to her burning forehead. The realization hit him. It was a slow, sickening wave. He grabbed the report on the stolen jewels. The necklace found in her velvet box. He looked at the signature of the maid who claimed to have seen her hide it. Mary! Mary had been dismissed from the estate 3 weeks before the jewels went missing. It was a web. It was a clumsy, pathetic web of lies. And he'd walked right into it. Lord Sterling, his cousin, his trusted friend. Sterling wanted the Blackwood fortune. Sterling needed the low-born duchess out of the way to marry his own sister to the duke. Alexander dropped the papers. They fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. The silence in the room was absolute. It was deafening. There was no traitor. There was no spy. There was only a terrified, innocent girl. A girl who loved him. A girl carrying his child. And he had thrown her to the wolves. His knees gave way. The great Duke of Blackwood hit the wooden floorboards. The sound was a heavy, hollow thud. He gripped the edges of the heavy oak desk. His knuckles turned bone white. He bowed his head. A sound tore from his throat. It was not a sob. It was a roar. It was the sound of a man being ripped in half by his own soul. It was a howl of pure, unadulterated agony. He was the monster. He was the villain of his own story. He had destroyed the only beautiful thing in his dark, miserable life. He had doomed his own son to grow up without a father. He pressed his forehead against the cold, rough wood of the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut. But the tears came anyway. They were hot. They were bitter. They tasted like salt and regret. Eleanor. The name was a prayer on his lips. A prayer he had no right to speak. He had to fix it. He had to crawl on his hands and knees over broken glass if he had to. He looked up. The candles flickered, casting long demonic shadows against the wall. He would burn Lord Sterling to ash. He would tear his own court apart. But first he had to go back into the storm. He had to face the woman he had broken. The sky over Oakhaven turned a bruised, violent purple. The ocean roared against the jagged black cliffs. The wind howled through the narrow, winding streets. Then the sky broke open. The rain fell in solid, freezing sheets. It was merciless. It was blinding. It was a perfect, cruel echo of the night he had destroyed his own soul. Alexander did not order his carriage. He did not grab a heavy wool cloak. He wore only his white linen shirt and dark trousers. He walked straight out of the inn and into the teeth of the storm. The icy drops slashed at his face like tiny knives. They soaked his clothes in seconds. They plastered his dark hair to his forehead. He welcomed the bitter biting sting. He wanted the cold. He wanted the punishment. It was nothing compared to the raging tearing agony in his chest. He walked through the empty town square. The cobblestones were slick and treacherous with mud. The world was a grey, rushing, violent blur. He didn't care if he caught his death. He didn't care if he drowned in the street. He only cared about the small bakery at the edge of the market. He reached the building. The windows were entirely dark. The painted wooden sign swung widely on its iron hinges. It squeaked and groaned in the howling wind. He stood before the heavy wooden door. He raised his fist. He knocked. The sound was immediately swallowed by a crack of thunder. He knocked again, harder, desperate. It was the frantic pounding of a dying man seeking salvation. Inside, a soft light flickered to life, a single candle. The heavy iron lock scraped. The door opened a fraction of an inch. Elena stood in the narrow gap. She held a brass candlestick in one hand. The golden light painted the delicate curves of her face. She wore a simple white linen nightgown. A thick shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her hair cascaded freely over her back. She looked like an angel guarding the gates of heaven against a demon of the dark. She saw him. Her eyes instantly hardened into dull, unbreakable flint. She moved to slam the door shut. Alexander moved faster. He did not push the door. He did not force his way inside. He simply collapsed. His knees hit the freezing mud. The sound was a wet, heavy, sickening thud. The great Duke of Blackwood, the most feared and powerful man in the realm, folded himself into the filthy dirt at her feet. Eleanor froze. The door hovered a mere inch from the frame. Alexander looked up. His face was a mask of sheer, undeniable devastation. The rain washed over his sharp features. It mixed freely with the hot, bitter tears streaming from his stormy grey eyes. "I know," he choked out. His voice was a raw, bleeding wound. It was torn to shreds by the roaring wind and his own suffocating grief. "I know everything." Eleanor did not flinch. She did not move. The candle flickered wildly in the cold draught. "Sterling." Alexander gasped. He bowed his heavy head. His forehead nearly touched the muddy, soaked leather of her boots. "The forged letters! The planted jewels! The poison they poured into my ears! I saw the ink, Eleanor. I saw the dates. I know you were innocent. I know they lied." Silence. Only the relentless roar of the rain answered him. "I know he is my son." Alexander wept. The words tore from his chest like jagged, broken glass. "I know I threw my pregnant wife into a freezing storm. I know what I did. I know I am a monster." He looked up again. He reached out a violently shaking, mud-streaked hand. He did not dare touch the pristine white hem of her gown. He held his hand inches away, suspended in the freezing rain. "I was terrified," he confessed. He laid his rotting black soul completely bare. "I was terrified of how much I loved you. I let my immense pride blind me. I let them manipulate my fear because I was a coward." He coughed harshly. The rain battered his broad, shaking shoulders. He looked so small. He looked entirely, irrevocably broken. He pressed his face into his muddy, trembling hands. His broad shoulders shook with violent, racking sobs. It was the terrifying sound of a man who had lost his mind to absolute grief. "Just let me breathe the same air as him," Alexander whispered into the wet dirt. "Just let me know you are safe. Please, Eleanor. I'm begging you. I'm on my knees in the mud, please." Eleanor looked down at the broken Titan. The freezing rain blew onto her face. It was ice cold. But it did not reach her heart. Her heart was permanently locked away in a solid steel box. It had to be. She had built that box to survive. She had built it for Leo. She looked at his shaking, pathetic frame. She remembered the warmth of his strong arms. She remembered the deep, rumbling sound of his laugh in the dark. Then she remembered the sound of the heavy oak doors slamming shut. She remembered the terrifying feeling of the icy mud seeping into her skin while she clutched her swollen, aching belly. She remembered waiting for death. Her face remained a flawless, terrifying mask of absolute ice. "You are 4 years too late, Your Grace," Eleanor said. Her voice was not angry. It was not loud. It was utterly, terrifyingly empty. "The sea took my husband, but he was a better man than you will ever be," she continued smoothly, twisting the invisible knife deeper into his chest. "He warmed me when you froze me. He loved me when you discarded me. He gave Leo a name when you gave him a death sentence. Alexander let out a shattered, breathless gasp. He clutched his chest as if she had shot him. Your apologies are worthless, Elena said. She stepped back into the golden warmth of her sanctuary. Your title means nothing here. Your tears are 4 years too late. You died to me that night in the rain, Alexander. And ghosts cannot beg. She looked at him one last time. There was absolutely no pity in her beautiful eyes. Only the cold, hard, unyielding reflection of a survivor. Do not knock on my door again. She closed the door. The heavy iron and bolt slid into place with a definitive, echoing final click. Alexander stayed on his knees. The rain beat mercilessly down on his back. The wind howled like a wounded animal. The freezing mud soaked through his fine trousers, chilling him to the bone. He stared blankly at the closed wooden door. He was completely alone in the dark, and this time the storm was inside him. The door was locked. The heavy iron bolt was secure. But Eleanor did not feel safe. She pressed her back against the solid wood. The cold from the rain seeped through the cracks. It chilled her spine. She slid down to the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. Alexander had been on his knees. The great Duke of Blackwood, crying in the freezing mud. A part of her wanted to weep. A part of her wanted to open the door. The ghost of the fragile girl who loved him screamed in the dark. She ruthlessly silenced it. She was a mother. She was a shield. There was no room for ghosts. She stood up. Her legs were shaky. She forced them to be strong. She walked through the dark bakery. The smell of burnt sugar lingered in the cold air. The ovens were silent. The wooden counters were clean. This was her sanctuary. This was her quiet, peaceful home. She had to leave it, tonight. She knew Alexander. She knew the terrifying, relentless power of the Blackwood name. He was broken now. Guilt had brought him down. But guilt was a fleeting emotion for powerful men. Soon, the grief would harden. The tears would dry. The Duke would remember who he was. He would remember he owned half the country. He would remember he had an army of ruthless lawyers. He had loyal guards. He had endless gold. He would not leave his sole heir in a coastal bakery. He would return. He would demand his son. The law would stand behind him. The world belonged to men like him. Eleanor would not let that happen. She would die first. She entered the small bedroom at the back of the shop. A single trembling candle cast dancing shadows on the plaster wall. Leo was asleep. He was a small lump beneath a thick patchwork quilt. His chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. He clutched his wooden boat tightly in one hand. Eleanor stared at his face, the dark, unruly curls, the strong jaw, the undeniable Blackwood bloodline. I will not let him take you, she whispered into the silence. It was a vow. It was an unbreakable oath forged in iron and fear. She moved quickly. She moved silently. Adrenaline burned hot in her veins. She pulled a worn leather satchel from under the bed. She opened the heavy wooden dresser. She did not pack the delicate linen dresses. She packed the thick wool, the rough spun shirts, the heavy cloaks. Survival prioritized over comfort. She walked to the loose floorboard near the cold stone hearth. She pried it open with a kitchen knife. She pulled out a small heavy canvas pouch. It clinked softly. Her savings. 4 years of flour, heat, and sweat. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to buy a carriage in the dead of night, enough to disappear. She shoved the pouch deep into the satchel. She buckled the leather straps. Her hands were trembling violently. She ignored them. The antique clock on the wall ticked loudly. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Time was slipping away. Every second she stayed was a second Alexander used to recover his immense strength. She walked over to the bed. She sat gently on the edge. The mattress sank slightly under her weight. She placed a hand on Leo's small shoulder. She shook him softly. Leo, she murmured. Her voice was incredibly steady. She hid her roaring terror behind a flawless wall of maternal warmth. The boy stirred. He rubbed his eyes with small, sleepy fists. He blinked in the dim golden candlelight. Mama, he mumbled. His voice was thick and heavy with sleep. Wake up, my little lion, she said softly. She stroked his messy hair. We are going on a trip. Leo sat up slowly. He looked around in confusion. A trip now, it is dark outside. It is a secret adventure. Eleanor lied smoothly. It was the most desperate lie of her life. We must leave before the sun wakes up. Will you be brave for me? Leo looked at her face. He saw the intense seriousness in her eyes. He nodded slowly. He clutched his wooden boat tighter against his chest. I am brave. I know you are, she whispered, kissing his warm forehead. She dressed him in his warmest, heaviest clothes: thick woolen trousers, a bulky knitted sweater, tiny leather boots. She wrapped a dark, heavy cloak securely around his shoulders. She swung her own thick cloak over her simple dress. She pulled the large hood up, hiding her face deep in the shadows. She grabbed the heavy leather satchel. She picked Leo up. He felt heavy. He was growing so fast, but she held him fiercely against her chest. He wrapped his arms around her neck and rested his head on her shoulder. He was already drifting back to sleep. Elena leaned over and blew out the candle. The room plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. She walked to the back door of the bakery. She paused. She took one last heartbreaking look around her sanctuary. The thick shadows hid the flower stains. They hid the warmth and the safety she had built from nothing. She turned the cold iron latch. She pushed the door open. The violent storm had finally passed. The heavy rain was gone, but a thick freezing fog had rolled in off the black ocean. It swallowed the cobblestone streets. It hid the entire world in a veil of chilling grey mist. It was perfect. It was a ghostly shroud to hide a mother and her child. Elena stepped out into the biting cold. She closed the door behind her. She did not bother to lock it. There was absolutely nothing left inside worth protecting. Her entire universe was in her arms. She began to walk toward the livery stables on the far edge of town. Her boots made soft, muffled sounds against the wet stones. The freezing fog wrapped around her like a damp blanket. She walked straight into the terrifying unknown. She was a fugitive. She was a mother on the run. And she would not stop running until the Duke of Blackwood was nothing but a nightmare lost in the dark. The hired carriage rattled. The wooden wheels groaned loudly against the rutted dirt road. The freezing fog clung to the glass windows. It was thick. It was blinding. Inside, the air was stale and brutally cold. Eleanor sat stiffly on the cracked leather seat. She held Leo tight against her chest. He was asleep, wrapped securely in a heavy wool blanket. The rhythmic, violent swaying of the carriage kept him under. Eleanor did not sleep. Her eyes darted constantly to the dark windows. Her heart beat a frantic, exhausting drum against her ribs. She listened to the thud of the horse's hooves. Thud, thud, thud. Every mile was a victory. Every shadow was a threat. They were an hour outside of Oakhaven. The town was behind them. The sprawling, dangerous world was ahead. Suddenly the carriage jerked. The horses screamed in panic. The driver shouted fiercely into the freezing mist. The carriage skidded violently on the wet dirt. The heavy iron wheels locked. They ground to a brutal, shuddering halt. Eleanor gasped loudly. She gripped Leo instinctively. Her blood turned to absolute ice. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the wet earth. Deliberate, powerful, terrifyingly familiar. They had not escaped. He had found them. Eleanor slid her free hand deep into her cloak. Her fingers wrapped around the cold wooden handle of a kitchen knife. It was a pathetic weapon against a duke. It was nothing against his guards. But a cornered mother was a deadly thing. She would not let him take her son. Footsteps approached the carriage door. The grey fog swirled around a massive dark silhouette. The iron latch clicked. The door swung forcefully open. Cold, damp air rushed into the cramped cabin. Alexander stood in the opening. He did not wear his immaculate velvet coat. He wore a simple dark riding cloak. It was completely soaked with heavy mist. His dark hair was wild. His stormy grey eyes were hollow, bloodshot, and frantic. He looked exactly like a ghost haunting the desolate moors. Eleanor raised the knife. Her hand shook violently. The sharp blade gleamed in the pale moonlight filtering through the fumes. "Stay back!" she hissed. Her voice was pure, lethal venom. "If you try to take him, I swear to God I will kill you!" Alexander looked at the trembling knife. He did not flinch. He did not step forward to disarm her. He looked past the blade to the sleeping boy in her arms. A look of unimaginable, soul-crushing pain crossed his sharp features. "I am not here to take him," Alexander said. His voice was a low, raspy whisper. It carried no command. It carried no aristocratic authority. It carried only absolute surrender. Eleanor's grip tightened on the handle. She did not believe him. Dukes did not surrender. Monsters did not yield. Alexander slowly reached into his soaked cloak. Eleanor braced herself. She prepared to strike. But he did not draw a weapon. He pulled out a thick, heavy leather folio. It was bound tightly with a red wax seal. The ancient seal of the Blackwood estate. He gently placed it on the empty, cracked leather seat across from her. "What is this?" Eleanor demanded. Her panicked eyes darted from his exhausted face to the folio. "Everything," Alexander answered simply. He took a slow, deliberate step back from the carriage. The thick fog coiled around his muddy boots. The deeds to the coastal estates, the shipping fleets, the gold reserves in the capital. He listed the items with a dead, hollow voice. "They are in his name." In Leo's name, in your name. You control it all. Elena stared at him. The knife wavered slightly in the air. This is a trick. There are no more tricks, Eleanor, Alexander said. A single ragged breath shuddered violently through his massive chest. I brought my lawyers to Oakhaven yesterday. It is done. The ink is already dry. I've stripped myself of the wealth. I've stripped myself of the terrifying power that made me a monster. He looked at her. He really looked at her. He saw the sheer terror in her beautiful eyes. He saw the desperate knife. And he hated himself more than he ever thought a human soul could endure. You were right to run, he confessed softly. I am a danger. My world is a poison. I dragged you into the dark once. I will not let my cursed shadow touch him. Alexander slowly sank to his knees, right there in the muddy, freezing road. Eleanor watched in completely stunned silence. The greatest, most feared lord in the realm was kneeling in the dirt. Again. I swear on my miserable life, Eleanor. Alexander vowed. His voice cracked deeply. It was a solemn, unbreakable oath. I will never force you. I will never take him from you. I will build an army to guard you from the shadows. I will bleed to ensure you never go hungry, but I will never cross your threshold unless you call my name. He bowed his heavy head. The cold mist settled on his dark hair like a physical weight. Go, he whispered. Live your life in the sun, and tell him his father was a fool. Alexander reached up with a shaking hand. He grabbed the handle of the carriage door. He did not look at her again. He could not bear to see the relief in her eyes. He pulled the heavy door shut. Click. He stepped back into the freezing fog. He raised his hand toward the front. Drive! His voice roared into the night. It was a thunderous order to her driver. The whip cracked sharply. The frightened horses surged forward. The carriage jolted violently and rolled away down the dark road. Eleanor sat frozen. The kitchen knife slipped from her numb fingers. It clattered loudly to the wooden floorboards. She looked out the small glass window. The massive, imposing figure of the Duke of Blackwood grew smaller and smaller. He remained entirely still on his knees in the mud. He didn't rise to follow them. He simply faded into the thick grey mist. She looked down at the heavy leather folio on the seat. She looked at the softly breathing boy in her arms. She had her son. She had her freedom. The monster had completely surrendered. But as the carriage rolled deeper into the endless night, the ultimate victory felt incredibly, inexplicably hollow. The snow fell thick and heavy over the village of Pinecrest.